In the spring of 2019, a retired surveyor named Earl Whitfield was mapping old watershed lines deep in the backcountry of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park when his boot broke through a rotted wooden plank barely visible beneath decades of leaf litter and moss. He caught himself on a cedar root, looked down into the darkness below, and felt a rush of cool, stale air rise up and hit his face. He had found the entrance to a tunnel that, as far as anyone could tell, had never appeared on any official map. Earl had spent 31 years walking these hills. He had found arrowheads, old bottles, rusted tools, but nothing had ever prepared him for what was waiting 60 feet underground, sealed behind a collapsed stone wall that someone had gone through considerable effort to hide. Over the following weeks, a small team of historians, archaeologists, and park rangers carefully excavated the tunnel. What they pulled out piece by piece redefined what we thought we knew about the people who had lived, worked, loved, and survived in these mountains for generations. 25 objects, 25 stories. Some of them will move you. Some of them will make you angry. And at least one of them should never have been buried at all. Before we go underground, if you have ever found something old and mysterious and felt that pull of history reaching through time to grab you, subscribe right now and hit the bell. You are going to want to be here for all of it. Let's start with number 25. Number 25 was a hand-carved wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, sealed with a strip of cured leather that had hardened into something almost like horn over the decades. When the team opened it, they found a collection of small, smooth river stones, each one painted with a single symbol in faded red pigment. Historians identified the symbols as belonging to a system used by Cherokee communities in the region during the early to mid-1800s. These were not decorative objects. They were markers, likely used to record agreements, transactions, or boundaries in a portable and discrete form. The Cherokee Nation had developed sophisticated systems of record-keeping long before contact with European settlers, and this box appeared to be a traveling archive of sorts, a compact way of carrying legal and social memory through terrain where paper would rot and ink would fade. The fact that it ended up sealed in an underground tunnel suggested it had been hidden deliberately, perhaps during one of the forced removal campaigns of the 1830s, when Cherokee families were given almost no time to gather belongings before being marched west on what history would come to call the Trail of Tears. Someone had chosen to protect this record at great personal risk. That act of preservation, performed in secret and under pressure, is as much a part of this object's story as the symbols themselves. Number 24 was a brass surveying compass, still in relatively good condition, its needle corroded to a dark greenish brown, but still able to move when gently cleaned. The compass bore a maker's mark from a Philadelphia instrument shop that operated between 1847 and 1871. Inside the lid, scratched in a careful hand, were two sets of initials and a date: JHB and WTM, 1862. The Civil War had fractured East Tennessee deeply. Unlike most of the Confederacy, the mountain counties of the region were largely Unionist in sympathy, and the area had been a site of fierce guerrilla conflict, neighbor against neighbor, family against family. A surveying compass hidden underground in 1862 almost certainly had a political story attached to it. Federal surveyors and scouts used such instruments to map terrain for troop movements. Finding one deliberately concealed suggests either that it was being kept from Confederate forces or that it was stashed by someone who never came back to retrieve it. Number 23 was a set of hand-forged iron hinges still attached to a fragment of rotted doorframe, the wood black and crumbling but the iron itself remarkably intact. The craftsmanship was exceptional. Each hinge had been worked with a decorative motif along its spine, a repeating pattern of small leaf shapes that took more time and skill than any purely functional piece would require. Blacksmithing in the Smoky Mountain region during the 1800s was a trade passed down within families, and a smith who took the time to put leaves on a door hinge was telling you something about who he was and what he thought of his work. These hinges had come from a door that mattered to someone: a home, a church, a storage building built with pride and maintained with care. The fact that they were underground at all suggested the structure they once belonged to had been dismantled, and someone had saved these as memory rather than let them be lost entirely. Number 22 was a glass medicine bottle, still corked, still containing a dark brownish liquid that had thickened to the consistency of molasses over the years. The bottle's embossed label read Henderson's Soothing Compound in raised letters along one side, with a stylized eye at the base. Patent medicines of the 19th century were famously unreliable at best and genuinely dangerous at worst, often containing alcohol, opium, chloroform, or other substances that no modern physician would prescribe. Henderson's was a real product, sold through general stores across Appalachia from the 1870s through the 1910s. That someone had stored a full, unopened bottle underground, alongside objects that appeared to have been deliberately preserved, raised the question of whether this was medicine being saved for future use, or a sample being kept as evidence of something. Researchers noted it alongside the other items without reaching a firm conclusion. Number 21 was a folded piece of oilcloth containing a hand-drawn map. The ink badly faded, but still legible under raking light. The map showed a section of the Oconaluftee River Valley, with small symbols marking what appeared to be homestead plots, mill locations, and what may have been a grist road. In the corner, a notation in pencil read simply, 1891 survey, disputed. Land disputes in the Smoky Mountains during the late 19th century were extraordinarily common and often violent. As timber companies moved into the region with industrial logging ambitions, small family landholders found their claims challenged, their surveys questioned, and their titles contested in courts hundreds of miles away. This map, hidden underground, may have been evidence in one of those disputes, preserved by someone who knew it might one day be needed and feared it might otherwise disappear. Number 20 was a pair of woman's leather shoes, high button style, size small, the leather dried and cracked, but the shape still perfectly intact. One of the buttons was missing. The shoes appeared to have been wrapped in cloth before being placed in the tunnel, which had helped protect them from the worst of the moisture. High-button shoes of this style were fashionable in the 1880s and 1890s, worn for church, for weddings, for any occasion that called for a woman to present herself with dignity. A pair of shoes hidden underground tells a story about someone who had something she could not afford to lose to the ordinary dangers of mountain life. They are small and worn and achingly ordinary, and they have outlasted almost everything else that ever belonged to whoever wore them. Number 19 was a small cast-iron cooking pot, roughly 2 quarts in volume, with a bale handle and 3 stubby legs. Cast iron was among the most prized possessions of mountain households in the 1800s because it was expensive, it was heavy to transport, and a good pot could last literally forever if properly maintained. This pot had been seasoned to a deep black and showed the wear of long, regular use. The legs were worn unevenly, suggesting it had spent years on an open hearth rather than a stove. It was packed inside the tunnel with its lid on, as though someone had set it down meaning to come back for it. That detail sits with you. Somebody put this pot down carefully and never returned. Now, before we get to item 18, I want to stop for 1 second. If you have a family member over 60 who grew up in the mountains or in a rural area, show them this video. I guarantee they will recognize things that have been missing from the conversation for too long. Okay, back to the tunnel. Number 18 was a child's slate board, the kind used in one-room schoolhouses from the 1840s through the early 1900s, before paper became cheap and widely available. The wooden frame had partially rotted, but the slate itself was unbreakable, and on its surface, faintly visible, were the remnants of chalk marks that had been imperfectly erased. An alphabet, practiced in a careful childish hand, a thruum visible before the letters became too faint to read. Someone had been learning to read and write in these mountains, practicing their letters on this small gray square of stone, and then this object had ended up sealed in the earth. The schoolhouses of the Smokies were often among the first buildings to go when communities were displaced or dispersed. A child's slate board underground is a small monument to interrupted education. Number 17 was a hunting rifle barrel, removed from its stock, the metal brown with surface rust but structurally sound. The bore was rifled, indicating it had been made or modified for accuracy rather than smooth-bore scatter. This was a tool for a serious hunter, someone who depended on precision for their food supply. The barrel had been wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas before being placed in the tunnel, a preservation technique that showed deliberate intent. Whether the rest of the rifle was somewhere else, or whether the barrel alone had been saved for the metal, or whether someone had been forced to disassemble and hide a weapon, was impossible to say with certainty. But the care that had gone into wrapping it suggested it was not abandoned. It was stored. Number 16 was a collection of dried seed packets, each one made from folded newsprint and sealed with beeswax that had yellowed and hardened to near amber. Inside, the seeds had dried to a perfect brittleness. Botanical analysis identified them as heirloom varieties of bean, corn, and squash that had largely disappeared from commercial cultivation by the mid-20th century. Mountain farming communities maintained seed lines for generations, selecting each year for the traits that best suited their specific soil, altitude, and climate. These were not just seeds. They were generations of accumulated agricultural knowledge compressed into tiny hard kernels, saved from some disaster, sealed with beeswax, and placed underground for a future planting that never came. Number 15 was a small leather Bible, its cover warped and the pages fused into a solid block by moisture, but with the name written in ink on the inside cover still legible. Martha Jane Caldwell, 1873. The Caldwell family was one of the oldest in the Oconaluftee Valley, with roots stretching back to some of the earliest white settlement of the region. Martha Jane Caldwell was a real person whose name appears in church records and census data. She was born in 1861 and appears in an 1880 census, but not in any record after 1884, when she would have been 23 years old. Her Bible ended up in this tunnel. What happened to Martha Jane Caldwell is a question the documents cannot answer. Number 14 was a copper still coil, the kind used in the construction of an illegal whiskey still. Coiled copper tubing roughly 18 inches long with fittings on each end. Moonshining in the Smoky Mountains was not merely an economic activity. It was a form of cultural resistance against federal taxation that mountain communities regarded as illegitimate, imposed on them by a government that had never done much for them in return. Still parts were frequently buried to hide them from revenue agents, and the tunnels and caves of the region served as improvised vaults for equipment that could not be found in a raid. This coil was simply one piece of a larger operation, but it told the story of a community that had developed its own parallel economy and its own logic for why the law did not apply in the same way underground as it did above it. Number 13 was a hand-stitched quilt fragment, roughly 3 feet square, made in a pattern called Grandmother's Flower Garden, using fabric scraps from what appeared to be multiple types of garments, work shirts, dress fabric, flour sack cotton. The stitching was extraordinarily fine, 60 or more stitches per inch in some sections, the kind of work that takes years of practice and hours of careful concentration. Quilts in Appalachian communities were not decorative objects. They were functional, they were expensive in terms of the labor they represented, and they were often the most complex objects a family owned. A quilt fragment underground was a piece of someone's domestic life, wrapped up and hidden. If you have ever been moved by old needlework, subscribe right now and leave a comment telling me what the most special handmade object in your family is. We are building something here, and I want to hear from you. Number 12 was a set of hand-carved wooden spoons, 6 of them, tied together with a length of twisted plant fiber. Each spoon had been carved from a different wood, and each had a small decorative detail at the end of the handle, a heart on one, a simple cross on another, initials on 2 others, a small animal shape that might have been a dog or a bear on the 5th, and a spiral on the 6th. These were gifts, almost certainly, carved by someone with real skill and real affection for the people who would receive them. They had been kept together, tied together, and placed underground together. Whatever family or community these spoons had belonged to, someone had treated them as a group, as things that went together and should be preserved together. Number 11 was a cast iron bell, roughly the size of a large grapefruit, with a simple clapper inside. Bells of this type were used to call farm workers in from fields, to signal meal times, to announce emergencies, or to mark the beginning and end of school. They were the communication infrastructure of rural communities before telephones, the way a voice could carry a mile through mountain terrain. This one was engraved around its rim with letters that formed the words, Pigeon Forge Community School, 1898, making it one of the most directly attributable objects in the collection. The Pigeon Forge Community School from that era had been documented, but no physical artifacts had previously been recovered. This bell was the first. Number 10 was a roll of unexposed photographic film in a metal canister, sealed with wax around the lid. Film photography reached rural Appalachia in the 1890s, though cameras remained expensive and film was precious. This canister appeared to date from around 1910 to 1920 based on its construction. The film inside was completely fogged by decades of chemical breakdown and could not be developed. Whatever images had been intended for that film, whatever faces or places or moments someone had meant to preserve, were gone. The canister itself survived. The images did not. There is something about that particular loss that sits differently from the others. Number 9 was a handmade fiddle, its body cracked along the top seam and one of its tuning pegs missing, but its general structure intact enough to be recognizable. The fiddle is the instrument most associated with Appalachian musical tradition, and the tradition of building fiddles from locally available materials, spruce tops, maple backs, cherry necks, goes back centuries in these mountains. This fiddle had been made by hand, with visible tool marks along the interior bracing that no machine would leave. Someone had built this instrument, learned to play it, or given it to someone who would, and then placed it underground, wrapped in what appeared to have been a wool blanket now reduced to fibers. Music had been important enough to try to save. Number 8 was a leather-bound journal, its pages partially legible after careful conservation treatment. The journal had been kept by a man who identified himself only as THB in entries spanning what appeared to be several years in the 1890s. The entries described daily farming life, weather patterns, animal behavior, plant cycles, and occasional notes on local events. One entry, dated what conservators estimated to be spring 1896, described a confrontation with men THB called the company men, who were attempting to survey land that the writer clearly believed belonged to him and his neighbors. Another entry, undated, read simply, "They came again. We moved everything we could. This may be when the tunnel was last used." THB never appeared again in the entries after that point. This is the moment in these kinds of stories where things get heavy. I want you to stay with me, because what comes next is not just history. It is something that still matters. Number 7 was a set of legal documents, folded and wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, partially legible. The documents appeared to be related to a land deed and a contested claim, with the names of what seemed to be multiple parties. The legible portions referenced acreage in the Oconaluftee region and bore what appeared to be notary stamps from the 1880s. Land documentation from this period in the Smoky Mountains was subject to deliberate tampering, loss, and destruction, particularly as large timber and land companies moved through the region, buying up or simply claiming acreage from families who lacked the legal resources to fight back. Someone had wrapped these documents carefully and placed them underground. They had understood that what was written on paper could be erased or stolen, but what was buried in stone might survive. Leave a comment right now if your family has a story about land that was taken or lost. You are not alone, and more people need to hear these stories. Number 6 was a clay pipe, clearly of Cherokee manufacture based on its form and the decorative incising around its bowl, depicting a repeating bird motif. Clay pipes were both practical and ceremonial objects in Cherokee culture, and the specific design language of the incising on this one suggested it had been made by a skilled artisan, rather than for everyday use. Finding a ceremonially significant Cherokee object alongside English-language legal documents and Appalachian household goods in the same tunnel was one of the most striking things about the collection as a whole. These were not separate histories. They were the same history, pressed together underground by the same forces that had pushed communities off their land and out of their homes. Number 5 was a hand-forged iron key, large and ornate, of a type used for heavy padlocks in the mid to late 1800s. No lock matching this key was found in the tunnel, and the key's specific design has not yet been matched to any known hardware from the region. It was the only object in the collection that remained genuinely unexplained at the time of the study's publication. keys without doors, locks without keys. There is a whole category of historical mystery that lives in that gap. Number 4 was a collection of dried medicinal herbs, each bundle wrapped in cloth and identified by a small tag in careful handwriting. The identifications were in English on some tags, and in Cherokee syllabary on others. The writing system developed by Sequoyah and adopted widely by the Cherokee Nation in the 1820s. The herbs included ginseng, black cohosh, bloodroot, and several others with documented medicinal and ceremonial uses in both Cherokee traditional medicine and Appalachian folk healing. The bilingual labels were a quiet, extraordinary detail. Whoever had assembled this collection had moved fluidly between two knowledge systems and had considered both worth recording precisely. Number 3 was a tintype photograph, the image faded but legible, showing a family group of 7 people posed in front of a wooden structure. The adults were dressed in their formal best, the children stiff and still in the way that long photographic exposures required. None of the faces could be identified with certainty, but the clothing and photographic technique dated the image to the 1870s or 1880s. They are looking directly at the camera, which means they are looking, at least in some sense, at us. 7 people who lived in these mountains, who built something or held something or lost something, who were important enough to someone that their photograph was wrapped and hidden and preserved underground for over a century. We do not know their names. We can see their faces. Number 2 was a handmade wooden toy, a small horse on a wheeled platform, carved with obvious care and painted in colors now faded to gray and brown. The wheels still turned. Someone had given this toy to a child, and then someone had wrapped it and placed it in a tunnel with the seeds and the spoons and the Bible and the legal papers. A child's toy, alongside the evidence of a community's survival strategy. That is a sentence that takes a moment to fully settle into you. Whoever sealed this tunnel was not only thinking about documents and tools and legal claims. They were thinking about the child who had played with this horse, about childhood itself, about what it meant to try to hold on to all of it. And now we come to number 1. The object that the team talked about longest. The object that none of them could quite agree on how to feel about. Number 1 was a wampum belt, approximately 18 inches long, woven from white and purple shell beads in a pattern that researchers identified as consistent with diplomatic wampum from the Eastern Cherokee tradition. Wampum belts in Eastern woodlands cultures were not currency in the Western sense, though European colonizers frequently misunderstood them as such. They were records, contracts, and diplomatic instruments. The patterns woven into them encoded specific agreements between specific parties, and the belts were held by the party responsible for remembering and honoring those agreements. A wampum belt was a living document, one that required a community of people to interpret it correctly, people who knew the patterns and what they meant and who had made them and what had been promised. This one had been sealed in an underground tunnel in the Smoky Mountains, likely sometime in the mid to late 1800s, and it had survived there for over a century without a community around it to give it voice. What agreement does it record? What promise is encoded in its white and purple pattern? The researchers were honest about the fact that they could not read it. The belt is currently in the care of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, who received it at a formal transfer ceremony in 2021. Whatever it says, whatever agreement it encodes, it is at least now back in the hands of people who have the tradition to interpret it. That is not a complete story, but it is a better one than an object sealed in stone ever being able to tell. 60 feet underground in the Great Smoky Mountains, someone built a room and filled it with memory, with seeds that held generations of agricultural knowledge, with a child's toy, with legal documents they hoped might one day matter, with a Bible belonging to a young woman who disappeared from the records at 23, with shoes and spoons and a fiddle and a wampum belt that holds a promise no one on the surface could read anymore. We talk about history as though it is something that happened and is now finished. But a sealed tunnel full of carefully wrapped objects is not the past making peace with being gone. It is the past refusing to accept that it has to disappear. It is someone, alone or in a small group, deciding that the things that mattered would survive, even if they did not, even if no one came back, even if the door they built into the hillside rotted shut, and a century passed before a surveyor's boot broke through. Now I want to ask you something directly. If you had 1 hour to seal something underground, 1 hour to put into a box, everything you wanted a stranger 100 years from now to understand about your life and your community and what mattered to you, what would you put in it? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if you found this video worth your time, share it with one person right now. One person who needs to know that history is not dead. It is just waiting underground for someone to break through the floor.